My name is Mason Walker. I'm 36 and I grew up knowing my brother was always the favorite. I kept my head down for years, swallowing every slight, every moment I was told to be grateful. But on the day of his glittering Savannah wedding, I walked in with one envelope that would shatter the image he'd built. Inside was proof of a $1 inheritance they'd kept from me and my daughter, and I was done keeping quiet. I was 36 when I finally admitted to myself that my family had always had a favorite, and it was never me. My name is Mason Caldwell. I work as a freelance structural engineer in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I have spent most of my life standing in the shadow of my younger brother Ryan Caldwell, a commercial attorney with the kind of polished charm my parents could never get enough of. From the time we were kids, my father Howard would introduce him to neighbors as the future of our family, while I got a half smile and a nod as if I were just there to fill the space. My mother Linda would save her warmest praise for Ryan's debate trophies or his acceptance into law school. When I built my first treehouse at 12 with nothing but scrap wood and a hammer, she barely glanced at it before asking if I had congratulated Ryan on his science fair ribbon. I learned early to keep my head down. I told myself I didn't mind that I liked working with my hands more than soaking in applause. After college, I took a job with a construction firm, learned the ins and outs of building codes, blueprints, and site inspections. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid work. Ryan, of course, landed an internship at a prestigious firm in Charlotte, and within a few years had his name on the door. Every holiday, my parents' conversations were filled with his cases, his clients, his latest vacation. When I tried to share a story from a project I was proud of, someone would change the subject or check their phone. Still, I kept trying to be part of their world. Sunday dinners at my parents' house were a tradition, and I showed up even when I was tired from a week on a job site. One evening, I brought a set of design plans for a municipal building I had been hired to consult on. I thought maybe, just maybe, my dad would take an interest. He glanced at the papers, set them aside, and called Ryan into the kitchen to show everyone a new watch he had bought on a recent trip to New York. Everyone gathered around him, their voices overlapping with excitement. I sat back at the table, swirling the ice in my glass, the plans untouched beside me. There was one night I will never forget. It was during a holiday dinner, the kind where extended family and old friends crowded into the dining room. The table was heavy with food, the air filled with the smell of roast turkey and cinnamon from the pies cooling on the counter. I was sitting across from Ryan, who was in the middle of telling a story about winning a difficult arbitration case. People laughed and clapped, my parents beaming at him like he had just brought home an Olympic medal. Then my father, holding his wine glass high, said loud enough for every person in that room to hear, "Ryan is the only real pride of this family." For a moment the chatter stopped. My ears rang. I saw a few of my cousins glance at me, their expressions a mix of discomfort and pity. I forced a small smile, pretending it didn't matter, but inside something shifted. I had spent years swallowing the little slights, the missed acknowledgments, telling myself they didn't define me. But hearing it so plainly, so publicly, was like a door closing on any hope that my father would ever see me for who I was. After that night, I started keeping my visits shorter. I'd arrive for dinner, stay just long enough to be polite, then make an excuse about an early morning job site meeting. I poured myself into work, eventually leaving the firm to go freelance. It gave me more control over my projects, more time to spend with my daughter Emily, who lives with my ex-wife Megan across town. Emily didn't care how many clients I had or whether I wore a suit. She cared that I built her a loft bed with my own hands, that I showed up for her soccer games, that I listened when she told me about her day. But even with that small sanctuary, the weight of being second best in my own family never really went away. Every time I saw Ryan's face in a family photo on my parents' mantle, every time I heard about his latest success through the grapevine, it reminded me of my place. I told myself I was fine with it, that I had built my own life and their approval was no longer something I needed. I almost believed it too until the day everything began to unravel. It was a cold Sunday morning in February of 2021 when my phone rang and I saw my mother's number. Her voice was flat, almost mechanical, as she told me my father had collapsed in the garage and by the time the ambulance arrived, there was nothing they could do. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor while she kept talking words about arrangements and relatives in the service, but they barely registered. Howard Caldwell was gone. No matter what had passed between us, the finality of it hit like a brick to the chest. The week after was a blur of casseroles from neighbors' phone calls, from distant relatives and visits to the funeral home. My mother moved through it all like she was following a script, shaking hands, thanking people for coming. Her eyes fixed somewhere far away. Ryan was the picture of composure, greeting guests with that confident voice he used in court, telling old stories about Dad's years running Caldwell Building Supply. I stayed mostly in this background, keeping an eye on my daughter Emily, who clung to my side in her black dress, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. At the graveside service, the wind cut through my suit jacket, carrying the smell of damp earth. My mother stood between Ryan and me, gripping his arm tightly. I watched the casket lower into the ground and tried to remember the last real conversation I'd had with my father. It had been months earlier, and even then it was mostly about Ryan's latest case. I told myself it didn't matter now, but a part of me ached for something that was never going to be fixed. In the days after the funeral, talk of the estate began to filter into conversation. Dad had built Caldwell Building Supply from nothing, and though he sold off part of it a few years back, the family still owned the main property and some assets. My mother assured me that everything would be handled fairly, that Dad's wishes were clear. I took her at her word. I had no reason to think otherwise. A month later, she called and said Ryan and she wanted me to come with them to meet with the family attorney, Mr. Watkins. His office was in a brick building downtown, the kind with brass nameplates and worn leather chairs. When I walked in, Ryan was already there, leaning against the receptionist's desk, chatting like he owned the place. My mother sat on a couch, flipping through a magazine, her reading glasses perched on her nose. We were led into a small conference room lined with shelves of thick legal books. Mr. Watkins, a thin man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, shook my hand, but didn't hold my eye for long. He cleared his throat and began outlining the basics. According to him, Dad's will left the majority of his assets, including the business property, to my mother, with certain items designated for Ryan. For me, there was what he called a small provision for support, an unspecified sum that would be transferred to my account within the year. I frowned, trying to piece that together. Dad had always said the company would be split between us when he was gone. I asked if I could see a copy of the will. Mr. Watkins shifted in his chair and glanced briefly at my mother before saying the documents were in order, and there was nothing unusual. He spoke in that smooth, rehearsed tone that lawyers use when they are closing a conversation. I caught it immediately, that tiny hesitation in his voice, the way he avoided my gaze. Ryan leaned back in his chair, smiling faintly as if this was all perfectly normal. My mother put a hand on my arm and said it was what Dad wanted, that I shouldn't worry about details. I nodded, though my mind was spinning. Part of me wanted to press to demand the papers right there and then, but another part thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Dad had changed his mind toward the end and decided Ryan was better suited to handle things. When the meeting ended, Ryan clapped me on the shoulder on the way out. His grip, firm in that way, meant to assert control. I walked to my truck, feeling a heaviness in my chest. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I told myself to let it go, to trust that if there was more I needed to know, my mother would tell me. Still, that look on Mr. Watkins's face stuck with me. The slight tightening around his mouth, the quick glance toward my mother before answering my question. It was small, easy to dismiss, but it lodged itself in the back of my mind. I drove home in silence, the hum of the tires on the asphalt filling the cab. Emily's soccer practice was that evening, and I decided not to think about legal documents or inheritances for the rest of the night. I put dinner on the table, asked Emily about her day, and forced myself to listen. But even as she told me about scoring a goal and the girls on her team arguing about who got to be captain, I kept seeing Mr. Watkins looking down at the folder in front of him, instead of meeting my eyes. There was something there, something I couldn't quite name yet, but it would not stay buried for long. By the spring of 2023, I had all but stopped thinking about my father's estate. Life had settled into its usual rhythm. I worked jobs that came through word of mouth, kept up with Emily's school events, and kept my distance from my mother and Ryan. Then one Saturday morning, while I was walking out of a hardware store with a bag of screws and a gallon of paint, I heard someone call my name. I turned and saw Grace Thompson, the woman who had lived next door to my parents for more than 20 years. She was holding a flat of flowers and grinning like she had just stumbled on a long-lost friend. We stood there in the parking lot, catching up. She asked about Emily, I asked about her grandkids. Then, as if she was commenting on the weather, she said she had seen Ryan a few weeks ago at a retirement party for one of Dad's old suppliers. She said he had been the life of the gathering, talking about how he was about to get over $1 million from selling the rest of Caldwell Building Supply. She even chuckled and said he made a joke about finally being able to buy that vacation home in Florida he had been eyeing. For a moment I thought I had misheard her. The words sank in slowly, my brain turning them over like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. Over $1 million, from selling the company, my father's company. I nodded like it was no big deal, but inside my chest my heart was pounding. Grace didn't notice. She adjusted her sunglasses and said she had to get back to planting before the rain came. We said goodbye, and I stood there for a moment staring at the asphalt, my hands tightening around the bag of screws until the plastic crackled. The drive home felt longer than usual. I kept replaying her words, measuring them against what Mr. Watkins had told me 2 years earlier. A small provision for support. No mention of any large sum, let alone $1 million. If Ryan was telling the truth, it meant either I had been completely misled or he was lying to impress people. Either way, it scraped open that old unease I had tried to bury. That afternoon, I pulled out a box from the top shelf of my closet where I kept old papers. Inside were a few letters from my father, some receipts from jobs I had done for him, and the business card Mr. Watkins had given me after our meeting. I stared at the card, tempted to call, but stopped. I didn't want to tip my hand without knowing more. For the rest of the weekend, I moved through chores in a fog, distracted enough that Emily asked me twice if something was wrong. I told her I was just tired. A week later, I got an envelope in the mail with elegant script across the front. Inside was a wedding invitation. Ryan Caldwell and Samantha Hayes request the honor of your presence, it read. The ceremony would be in late May at an estate in Savannah, Georgia. The cardstock was thick, the kind you knew cost a fortune. My eyes caught on the line listing the invited guest, Mason Caldwell. The misspelling was small, just one letter off, but it landed like a jab. I turned the card over in my hands, wondering if it was intentional or just careless. Knowing my family, it could have been either. I set the invitation on the kitchen counter and walked away, but it seemed to follow me around the house. At night, while washing dishes, I would glance over at it and feel a knot tighten in my stomach. The combination of Grace's story and that invitation made it impossible to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. My father had built that business over decades, and if there was money from selling it, I had a right to know why I was left out of the conversation. A few days later, I saw my mother's name flash on my phone. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message asking if I had received the invitation and saying she hoped I would make arrangements to attend. Her tone was polite, but there was a stiffness to it, like she was reciting lines she had practiced. I didn't call back. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with the invitation in front of me and a pen in my hand, scribbling questions on a notepad. When was the sale? Who authorized it? Where did the money go? The more I wrote, the angrier I felt. I kept the notepad in a drawer and tried to focus on work, but the questions stayed close. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be Ryan calling to gloat. I pictured him walking into his wedding surrounded by friends and colleagues laughing about the fortune he had just secured. The image made my jaw clench. One evening, Emily sat at the table doing homework while I cooked dinner. She asked if we were going to Uncle Ryan's wedding. I told her I didn't know yet. She said she liked Savannah because of the big trees and the smell of the ocean. I smiled at her, but inside I was thinking about how much I hated the idea of standing in that crowd, pretending everything was fine while I had this unanswered storm brewing inside me. By the end of the month, I knew I couldn't just show up and play the part of the older brother who had no stake in anything. Grace's words had lit a fuse, and the invitation had been the spark that kept it burning. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew I was done looking the other way. ChatGPT deny. A week later, my phone rang just as I was finishing up a set of blueprints at the kitchen table. I saw my mother's name on the screen, and for a second I thought about letting it go to voicemail again. Curiosity won out, and I answered. Her voice was brisk, no small talk, no asking how Emily was doing. She said she wanted to be clear about something before it became a problem. I should not come to Ryan's wedding. It would make people uncomfortable. Her words came out clipped and practiced as if she had been rehearsing them. I asked her why, and she sighed, that long theatrical sigh she used when she thought I was being difficult. She said the wedding was supposed to be a happy day for Ryan and Samantha, and it would not be appropriate to drag up money matters in front of the Hayes family. The way she said money matters made my stomach tighten. I told her I had not said anything to anyone about bringing up money. She paused for just a beat too long and then said she thought it was best for everyone if I simply stayed home. The silence stretched. I could hear the faint hum of her refrigerator in the background. Then she added almost casually that if I agreed to keep quiet about certain things, she could make sure I received some support after the wedding. The word support hung in the air like a bad smell. I asked her what exactly she meant by certain things. She said I knew what she was talking about. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the blueprints spread in front of me, but not really seeing them. This was not just about avoiding an awkward scene. This was about making sure I stayed out of the way. I told her I appreciated her concern, but I would make my own decision about attending. Her tone sharpened. She said she hoped I would not make a mistake I could not take back. Then she ended the call without saying goodbye. I sat there for a long time after phone still in my hand, the quiet of the house pressing in around me. It was the first time she had been so direct about wanting me gone from something important. Growing up, the favoritism toward Ryan had been wrapped in politeness, the kind of smiles that cut without leaving a visible mark. This was different. This was a gate slammed shut right in my face. That night, Emily came into the kitchen while I was making dinner. She asked if Grandma was coming to visit soon. I told her probably not. She noticed the look on my face and asked if something bad had happened. I shook my head and told her we were fine. She went back to the living room, but every so often I caught her watching me from the couch. Over the next few days, I kept turning the conversation over in my mind. Her hint about support was not lost on me. I had been barely scraping by with freelance work and odd jobs. A check from her could have taken the pressure off for a while. But the thought of accepting it made my chest feel heavy. It would be buying my silence, and worse, it would be teaching Emily that you can be paid to ignore what is wrong. Late one night, I sat at my desk with a legal pad, jotting down everything I remembered from the meeting with Mr. Watkins, every offhand comment from my mother and Ryan about the company, and now this phone call. The more I wrote, the more certain I became that there was something real behind my suspicions. I still did not know exactly how I would handle it, but one thing was clear. I would not be staying home. The next morning, I booked a modest room in Savannah for the weekend of the wedding. I kept the confirmation email in a separate folder on my laptop where Emily would not see it. I told no one. When my mother called again 2 days later and left a breezy voicemail asking if I had thought about what she said, I did not return the call. I went about my work, finishing up a project for a small developer outside of town. But my mind kept circling back to the image of standing in that wedding hall. I imagined Ryan smiling for the cameras, shaking hands, thinking he had the whole day under control. The idea of him being blindsided by the truth was like a small ember in my chest, steady and warm. By the end of the week, I had packed a small suitcase and tucked it under my bed. I kept my plans quiet even from Emily, though I knew I would have to tell her soon. The less anyone in my family knew, the better. I did not want to give them the chance to cut me off before I even arrived. When Friday night came, I stood at the window with the lights off, looking out at the street. The house was quiet, the only sound the hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Somewhere between my mother's warning and my own stubbornness, a decision had taken root. I was going to that wedding. I was going to see this through, whatever it took. A week later, my phone rang just as I was finishing up a set of blueprints at the kitchen table. I saw my mother's name on the screen, and for a second I thought about letting it go to voicemail again. Curiosity won out, and I answered. Her voice was brisk, no small talk, no asking how Emily was doing. She said she wanted to be clear about something before it became a problem. I should not come to Ryan's wedding. It would make people uncomfortable. Her words came out clipped and practiced as if she had been rehearsing them. I asked her why, and she sighed, that long theatrical sigh she used when she thought I was being difficult. She said the wedding was supposed to be a happy day for Ryan and Samantha, and it would not be appropriate to drag up money matters in front of the Hayes family. The way she said money matters made my stomach tighten. I told her I had not said anything to anyone about bringing up money. She paused for just a beat too long and then said she thought it was best for everyone if I simply stayed home. The silence stretched. I could hear the faint hum of her refrigerator in the background. Then she added almost casually that if I agreed to keep quiet about certain things, she could make sure I received some support after the wedding. The word support hung in the air like a bad smell. I asked her what exactly she meant by certain things. She said I knew what she was talking about. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the blueprints spread in front of me, but not really seeing them. This was not just about avoiding an awkward scene. This was about making sure I stayed out of the way. I told her I appreciated her concern, but I would make my own decision about attending. Her tone sharpened. She said she hoped I would not make a mistake I could not take back. Then she ended the call without saying goodbye. I sat there for a long time after, phone still in my hand, the quiet of the house pressing in around me. It was the first time she had been so direct about wanting me gone from something important. Growing up, the favoritism toward Ryan had been wrapped in politeness. The kind of smiles that cut without leaving a visible mark. This was different. This was a gate slammed shut right in my face. That night, Emily came into the kitchen while I was making dinner. She asked if Grandma was coming to visit soon. I told her probably not. She noticed the look on my face and asked if something bad had happened. I shook my head and told her we were fine. She went back to the living room, but every so often I caught her watching me from the couch. Over the next few days, I kept turning the conversation over in my mind. Her hint about support was not lost on me. I had been barely scraping by with freelance work and odd jobs. A check from her could have taken the pressure off for a while, but the thought of accepting it made my chest feel heavy. It would be buying my silence, and worse, it would be teaching Emily that you can be paid to ignore what is wrong. Late one night, I sat at my desk with a legal pad, jotting down everything I remembered from the meeting with Mr. Watkins, every offhand comment from my mother and Ryan about the company, and now this phone call. The more I wrote, the more certain I became that there was something real behind my suspicions. I still did not know exactly how I would handle it, but one thing was clear. I would not be staying home. The next morning, I booked a modest room in Savannah for the weekend of the wedding. I kept the confirmation email in a separate folder on my laptop where Emily would not see it. I told no one. When my mother called again 2 days later and left a breezy voicemail asking if I had thought about what she said, I did not return the call. I went about my work, finishing up a project for a small developer outside of town. But my mind kept circling back to the image of standing in that wedding hall. I imagined Ryan smiling for the cameras, shaking hands, thinking he had the whole day under control. The idea of him being blindsided by the truth was like a small ember in my chest, steady and warm. By the end of the week, I had packed a small suitcase and tucked it under my bed. I kept my plans quiet, even from Emily, though I knew I would have to tell her soon. The less anyone in my family knew, the better. I did not want to give them the chance to cut me off before I even arrived. When Friday night came, I stood at the window with the lights off, looking out at the street. The house was quiet, the only sound the hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Somewhere between my mother's warning and my own stubbornness, a decision had taken root. I was going to that wedding. I was going to see this through, whatever it took. Ban đã nói, Chapter 5. Đồng minh bất ngờ xuất hiện. Mason tìm đến Daniel Brooks bạn cũ và là luật sư bất động sản kể lại nghi ngờ. Daniel đồng ý giúp, bắt đầu yêu cầu bạn sao di chúc và hồ sơ probate. Việc tiếp cận hồ sơ gặp trở ngại khi tòa án phản hồi chậm, buộc Mason phải ký đơn yêu cầu chính thức và cho xử lý. Cuối cùng họ phát hiện một bản di chúc công chứng ghi rõ Mason là người thừa hưởng 1 tiền mặt từ việc bán công ty. Mini climax: Daniel chỉ vào điều khoản ghi tên Harper, con gái Mason, như động thừa hưởng, khiến Mason bừng hiểu đây không chỉ là chuyện của mình mà còn liên quan trực tiếp đến quyền lợi của con. Đọc kỹ Chapter 4 đã viết bên trên và dàn ý Chapter 5 viết tiếp trực tiếp từ câu cuối của Chapter trước. I was going to see this through whatever it took. Viết Chapter mime 1.200 từ theo dàn ý đã duyệt, viết liền mạch chuyển và câu đầu không lặp lại câu cuối của Chapter trước. First person storytelling, tiếng Anh chuẩn Mỹ, cảm xúc, có hành động hội thoại, nội tâm phù hợp văn hóa Mỹ. Không CTA, kết thúc tự nhiên tại điểm pause phù hợp để dễ viết phần tiếp theo. Thầy tất cả tên tuổi, địa danh công ty phù hợp với văn hóa Mỹ. Viết sạch plain text, không markdown emoji, ký tu la, không được dùng dấu nổi từ và. Viết liền mạch, liền lời kể ngất nghĩ tự nhiên bằng dấu chấm và dấu phẩy, không dùng dấu 2 chấm hay dấu ngoặc kép, chỉ xuống dòng nếu cần thiết. Không phân tích, không giới thiệu, bắt đầu ngay bằng câu đầu tiên. ChatGPT đã nói. The next morning, I drove across town to a brick office building that had seen better days. Daniel Brooks's name was stenciled on the glass door in fading gold letters. We had gone to high school together, played on the same baseball team, and lost touch after college. I had heard he was practicing real estate law now, mostly handling property disputes and zoning cases. I figured if anyone would give me a straight answer without running to my family, it would be him. He looked up from behind a cluttered desk as I stepped in, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up. He grinned when he recognized me, but it faded when he saw my face. We shook hands and I sat across from him. I told him I needed his help with something I could not talk about with anyone else. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and waited. I told him about my father's death, the vague promises of an equal split, the meeting with Mr. Watkins, where I was told I would get only a small support sum, and the way my mother had called to keep me from the wedding. I did not mention Grace's comment yet. I wanted to see his reaction to the facts I could prove. Daniel listened without interrupting, only raising an eyebrow when I mentioned the part about support after the wedding. When I finished, he tapped a pen against his desk. If there was a will that went through probate, he said it should be public record unless it was under seal. He offered to file a request with the county clerk's office for a copy. He also suggested pulling the probate file to see the full accounting of assets. I agreed and signed the forms he pushed across the desk. A week later, he called to say the clerk's office had been slow to respond. They sent a partial file but no copy of the will. He suspected it was still in processing or someone had requested a delay. He asked if I wanted to sign a formal motion to compel release of the documents. I did not hesitate. We filed it that same afternoon. The waiting was the worst part. Every day I checked my phone more than I cared to admit. When the court finally responded, Daniel asked me to come in. I walked into his office and found a manila envelope on his desk. He slid it open with a letter opener and slid the contents toward me. The top page was a notarized copy of my father's last will and testament. My eyes scanned the lines until I found my name. Mason Walker, to receive the sum of $1 million from the sale of Walker Building Supply, in equal share with his daughter Emily Walker. I froze. Daniel leaned forward, pointing at the clause. It was crystal clear. There was no mention of a support payment, no conditions, no loopholes. My daughter's name in black ink on official paper hit me harder than the dollar figure. This was not just about me. They had tried to take something that belonged to her. I felt my jaw tighten as a heat rose in my chest. Daniel watched me carefully and asked if I wanted to move forward. I told him yes, absolutely. He nodded and said we would need to verify the sale records for the company and ensure the funds had been transferred according to the will. He suspected they had already moved the money. That would mean a fight to get it back. I left his office with copies of the will in a folder under my arm. Sitting in my truck, I opened it again, tracing Emily's name with my finger. It made my decision for me. This was no longer just about showing up at a wedding to prove a point. It was about protecting what was hers by right. That night, I tucked the folder into the bottom drawer of my desk, locked it, and kept the key in my pocket. I did not tell Emily the details, only that I was working on something important for us. She nodded, not pressing for more, but I could tell she sensed the shift. I was not just reacting anymore, I was moving with purpose. Freelance jobs trickled in slowly that month. A remodel blueprint for a small coffee shop in Knoxville, a consultation on load-bearing beams for a lakeside cabin in Alabama, and a renovation plan for a warehouse that might never get funded. The invoices went out, but the payments would not land in my account for weeks. My checking balance dipped lower than I liked, and each trip to the grocery store had me scanning prices more than usual. The pressure bled into everything else. Olivia called one evening after Harper's soccer practice. She had heard about the wedding through mutual friends and wanted to know if I was planning on taking Harper. When I told her yes, she didn't hesitate to say she was against it. She thought the tension between me and my family was bad enough, but dragging our daughter into it would be crossing a line. I told her this was not about dragging Harper anywhere. It was about her seeing that her father would stand up when something was wrong. She sighed, and I could hear the clatter of dishes in the background. She reminded me Harper was only 10, too young to be pulled into adult fights, too young to watch relatives glare across a ballroom over money and resentment. I told her I understood, but this was also about her future. Olivia didn't agree, but she didn't push it further. 2 days later, an email from Evan landed in my inbox. The subject line read simply "wedding." I clicked it and found 2 short paragraphs. He wrote that he hoped I would make the right choice and stay home, that the day was about him and Samantha, not old grudges. Then came the line that made my teeth grind. "Don't turn my happiest day into your stage," he closed with a thinly veiled threat, saying he would consider legal action if I disrupted the event. I stared at the screen, the glow of the monitor throwing harsh light across my desk. My first impulse was to fire back, but I didn't. There was nothing I could say that would matter to him, and any reaction would only feed his narrative that I was the problem. Instead, I slid the email into a folder labeled "wedding." I kept everything there now: court filings, Daniel's notes, printouts of the will. My evidence. The more I looked at it, the more I realized Evan was already nervous, otherwise he wouldn't bother warning me. That was its own kind of leverage. The rest of the week I focused on the work I had and tried to cut back on expenses. Harper stayed with me one night and we made spaghetti with jarred sauce and garlic bread from a discount loaf. She asked if she would get to wear something fancy for the wedding, and I told her we'd figure it out. Her smile was all I needed to remember why I was doing this. At night, when the house was quiet, I sat at my desk with Daniel's latest updates. The sale records for Walker Building Supply were still pending from the state archives, but Daniel believed we would have them before the wedding date. Once we had those, the timeline would be undeniable. By the time Friday rolled around, I had stopped thinking of the wedding as a family event. To me, it was a court date without the judge, a place where the truth would have an audience. That was worth whatever tension it stirred. ChatGPT and I, Savannah greeted us with warm air that smelled faintly of salt and magnolia. The historic district seemed to glow in the late afternoon sun, its cobblestone streets and oak trees draped in Spanish moss like something from a painting. Harper sat beside me in the cab, her face pressed to the window, eyes wide at the horse-drawn carriages and grand old buildings. She wore a simple navy dress we had found on sale, and I could tell she felt proud of it. When we pulled up to the venue, the scale of it hit me. The Mercer House stood like a monument to old Southern wealth, its red brick walls trimmed with white columns and iron balconies. Strings of white lights wound around the banisters, and a quartet played soft classical music under a tent on the front lawn. Valets in black suits hurried to take cars as guests stepped out in gowns and tuxedos that looked like they belonged on magazine covers. I adjusted the cuffs of my old charcoal suit. It was clean and pressed, but I knew it looked dated, the cut a little too boxy, the fabric worn smooth at the elbows. Harper squeezed my hand as we walked up the steps, her small voice asking if we should find where to sit. I told her we'd check in first. Inside, the air smelled of lilies and expensive perfume. Chandeliers dripped crystal light over polished marble floors. Staff in white jackets moved like clockwork, balancing silver trays with champagne flutes. Guests milled about in small clusters, their laughter light and practiced. I caught my reflection in one of the tall mirrors and saw what they would see: a man who didn't quite fit a shadow in a place made of bright polished surfaces. I felt the eyes before I heard the whisper. Near the far wall, a pair of older women leaned in close. One tilted her head toward me and murmured something. The other's gaze slid over me and away, her expression neutral but dismissive. A man in a blue dinner jacket near the bar asked the group beside him if that was Evan's brother, his tone carrying the edge of curiosity that wasn't entirely kind. I didn't catch the answer. Then I saw Samantha. She stood with her bridesmaids near the double doors that led to the courtyard, her ivory dress catching the light like water. Her smile was in place, perfect for photographs, but when her eyes found me across the room, the smile faltered. For just a second, something passed over her face. Not surprise exactly, and not annoyance either. More like calculation. Her gaze lingered longer than it should have before she turned back to the women beside her. Harper tugged my sleeve, asking if she could look at the fountain outside. I nodded, letting her wander within sight. I stayed by the edge of the room, scanning the crowd. Evan was nowhere yet, but I knew he would make an entrance when it suited him. The murmur of conversation rose and fell like the tide, but my mind kept circling back to that look from Samantha. A waiter offered me champagne, and I accepted, holding the glass but not drinking. My eyes followed Harper as she walked along the courtyard path, pausing to watch koi fish in the pond. She looked small under the spread of the oak branches, but also steady. I found myself thinking about the will again, about her name printed there beside mine, and my chest tightened. Someone brushed past me, the scent of cologne sharp in the air, and I heard a low voice say that the groom's family was here in full force tonight. The words weren't meant for me, but they landed all the same. I stood a little straighter, my fingers tightening around the stem of the glass. Across the room, Samantha glanced my way again. This time she didn't look away as quickly. ChatGPT'd an I. The band had just finished a slow jazz number when Evan finally appeared, cutting through the crowd with that easy confidence he'd perfected over the years. He wore a custom-tailored black tuxedo that probably cost more than my monthly rent, his hair slicked back, his smile wide and rehearsed. Guests turned toward him like flowers bending to the sun. He took the microphone from the bandleader, thanking everyone for coming and sprinkling in little jokes about travel delays, overindulgence at the bar, and the weather being just like we ordered. The crowd laughed in all the right places. Then his eyes found me, and something sharpened behind his smile. "We've got family here tonight," he said, voice carrying easily over the speakers. "And I'd like my big brother Mason to come up and say a few words." A murmur rippled through the guests, some turning to look at me, others craning their necks as if they weren't sure they'd heard right. My chest tightened, and I caught Harper watching me from near the fountain, her brow furrowed. I set down my champagne and made my way forward, every step echoing in my ears. Evan held the mic just out of my reach, grinning. For those of you who don't know, Mason's had quite the journey. Not exactly the 9-to-5 type. More of a free spirit, right? He chuckled, and a few polite laughs followed. There were times let's just say he had to lean on the family a bit, but we always looked out for each other. I stopped in front of him, letting the weight of the moment stretch. His eyes glittered with something between challenge and amusement. Harper had moved closer now, her small hands gripping the edge of a chair, her face searching mine for what I'd do next. Evan gestured toward the mic, the perfect host making space for the reluctant guest. The room had gone quiet enough that I could hear the faint hum of the amplifiers and the rustle of dresses as people shifted in their seats. I took the mic slowly, my fingers brushing his, just enough to let him know I wasn't in a hurry. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. I looked out over the crowd, seeing faces I recognized and many I didn't. The words I wanted to say burned in my chest, but I kept them there for now. Instead, I let the silence hang for a moment longer, watching the anticipation build like pressure in a sealed jar. Evan was still smiling, but I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. Somewhere in the back, a glass clinked against another and the sound seemed louder than it should have been. Harper's eyes didn't leave mine. I let out a slow breath and glanced briefly at Samantha. She was watching intently, her expression unreadable, her hands clasped tightly in front of her bouquet. I wondered just for a second if she already knew what was coming. I slipped my hand into the inside pocket of my jacket and felt the crisp edge of the envelope. My pulse slowed, my mind clear in a way it hadn't been in months. I held it up so everyone could see and slid out 2 neatly folded documents, the seal and signature catching the light from the chandeliers. This, I began, is a certified copy of my father, Richard Walker's last will and testament, along with the probate court's record of filing. I unfolded the first page slowly, letting the sound of the paper fill the silence. I read aloud the exact clause that named me, Mason Walker, and my daughter Harper Walker as the recipients of $1 million in cash proceeds from the sale of Walker materials. My voice was steady, but I could feel the air in the room change as if the temperature had dropped. No one moved. The clink of silverware and the low hum of conversation had vanished completely. Every eye was on me. I turned the page so the embossed stamp was visible to the front rows. These are public records, I said, available to anyone who requests them from the Chatham County Probate Court. From the corner of my vision, I saw Samantha step forward from the head table. Her gown swayed slightly as she moved, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She reached me without hesitation, her hand extended for the papers. I handed them to her without a word. She read quickly but carefully, flipping between the will and the probate filing. When she finished, she turned toward Evan, her voice sharp and clear enough to carry to the farthest table. "Why did you and your family hide this?" Evan froze, his mouth slightly open but no words coming out. Eleanor, seated just a few feet away, had gone pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She shifted back in her chair, one hand gripping the tablecloth as if to steady herself. Samantha's eyes moved between them, waiting for an answer that never came. A ripple of murmurs spread through the guests, some leaning toward each other, others pulling out their phones. A few were already recording. Evan finally managed to say, "This isn't the time or place." Samantha didn't flinch. "It's exactly the time and place, Evan. You invited your brother up here to humiliate him, and instead, he just exposed something the entire room deserves to know." Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. Her voice was low but strained. "This is a misunderstanding. We can discuss it privately." Samantha held the documents up for anyone to see. "This isn't a misunderstanding. This is in writing, signed, notarized, and filed with the court." The noise in the room grew louder, people shifting in their seats, some standing for a better view. Evan's best man leaned in to whisper something to him, but Evan brushed him off, his eyes locked on me now, the polished smile long gone. Harper had moved closer to the stage, her small face tilted up at me with a mix of confusion and pride. I gave her the slightest nod, a silent promise that this wasn't over. Around us, the ballroom felt different. The gold and white decor, the glittering lights, the carefully arranged flowers, all of it seemed less like a celebration and more like a set where the wrong scene was playing out. The perfect image Evan had crafted was cracking, and everyone could see the fracture lines. Samantha's gaze hardened as she held the papers in her hand. The weight of the silence pressed down on the room until she finally spoke. "I can't marry a man who lies and takes what isn't his, especially from his own brother and niece." The words landed like a slap, sharp and echoing. She slipped the engagement ring from her finger and set it on the table in front of Evan. A collective gasp moved through the guests. Evan didn't reach for the ring. His face was frozen in a look I had never seen before, somewhere between shock and panic. Eleanor's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her head tilted downward as if the intricate table runner had suddenly become fascinating. She didn't say a word. Samantha stepped down from the small stage, her gown trailing behind her as she walked toward the exit. No one tried to stop her. The photographer, unsure whether to keep shooting, lowered his camera. The band in the corner remained silent, their instruments resting in their laps. Evan stayed rooted in place, his posture rigid, but his eyes darting, searching for someone to speak or do something to change what had just happened. No one did. I felt Harper's small hand slide into mine. She leaned close and whispered, "Dad, you did the right thing?" Her voice was quiet but steady, and I squeezed her hand gently in response. Richard, seated near the front, didn't lift his eyes from the floor. It was the first time I had seen my father look smaller than his frame, as if something in him had given way. He didn't glance at me, didn't glance at Evan. Around us, whispers grew louder, pockets of conversation blooming like wildfires. Some guests slipped out the side doors, while others remained glued to their seats, too intrigued to leave. A few phones were still raised, recording every detail. Evan finally moved his hand, brushing the ring on the table before pulling it back. He looked toward me, his expression stripped of the smug confidence he had worn all evening. I met his stare without flinching. Harper shifted closer to my side, and in that moment I knew the fallout from this night would reach far beyond this ballroom. The lie was out, the truth in plain sight, and nothing in our family would ever be the same again. 3 months later, the probate court issued its final order. The judgment was clear and direct, requiring the full transfer of $1 million to me and Harper. Sitting in the courtroom that morning, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion wash over me. Daniel slid the paperwork across the table, his expression carrying that quiet satisfaction of a man who had fought and won. Harper wasn't there, but I pictured her face when I would tell her. The news had already traveled faster than the legal documents. By the time I left the courthouse, whispers had turned into full stories across Nashville and Savannah. The headlines weren't gentle. They spoke of a wedding stopped in its tracks, of a will hidden from its rightful heirs, of a family's reputation unraveling in public view. Evan took the hardest public blow. His construction firm lost 2 of its largest contracts within weeks. One client cited concerns over integrity, the kind of phrase that sticks to a man like tar. Rumors swirled that more partners were looking for an exit, and each time his name came up in a business circle, someone would mention the wedding. Eleanor was quieter in her fall, but no less visible. She lost her seat on the church's charitable board, replaced by someone the congregation trusted. At first, she tried to spin it as a voluntary step back, but people knew better. In a small city, silence often speaks louder than explanations. Richard stopped calling. I heard from an old neighbor that some of his oldest friends had cut ties. They'd shared coffee and fishing trips for decades, but none of them wanted to be associated with the scandal. I didn't take joy in it, but I couldn't ignore the irony. Life for me shifted into something steadier. I opened an account for Harper's college fund and placed a sizable portion of the settlement there. Knowing she would have that security felt better than any personal victory. The rest I invested into a small structural design company I had been sketching out for years. I rented a modest office downtown, hired 2 engineers I trusted, and started building something that was mine from the ground up. The first project was a simple redesign for a warehouse renovation. Nothing flashy, but it was honest work. Walking through the site one afternoon, I thought about my father's old company and how differently things might have turned out if respect had outweighed greed. Some nights I would still think back to the ballroom, the way the air had shifted when Samantha spoke, the way Harper's hand had felt in mine. Those moments had cost me a lifetime of keeping the peace, but they had also given me the one thing I never thought I'd have again. control over my own story, Savannah faded into the background, replaced by new clients, new projects, and a sense of forward motion I hadn't felt in years. There were still awkward encounters in town, still people who hesitated before meeting my eyes, but they no longer mattered. What mattered was that Harper knew the truth. The court had made it official, and the chapter that had once defined me was now just a part of the past. The months that followed found a quiet steadiness I had not known in years. Work was steady, my small design firm slowly growing with contracts I could be proud of. Evenings with Harper became the anchor of my days, her laughter filling the apartment again. She still asked about what happened, but less often now, as if the answers had settled into her in their own way. Olivia softened too. One afternoon, she admitted she had misjudged me, that standing up for the truth had been the right thing. We were not suddenly close, but there was mutual respect, a shared focus on Harper's well-being. On weekends, Harper would sit in my office sketching buildings of her own. I pinned them on the wall, reminders of why I had fought. She may not grasp every legal detail, but she knows her father didn't let anyone take away what was hers. That is enough for now. I learned that justice does not arrive on its own. Sometimes it must be demanded in daylight, even if it costs you comfort. Peace without truth is only a pause before the next wrong. I could not let that happen, and I am glad I didn't. One evening, Harper and I stood on the balcony of our new apartment, the Nashville sky fading to deep gold. I told her no one has the right to take what belongs to her, not her money, not her dignity, not her truth. She met my eyes, nodding with a quiet certainty that told me she believed me. That was the real closure, not the court ruling or the money, but knowing my daughter would grow up believing her voice mattered, that her place could not be erased. If you have ever had to stand up for what is right for your family, you know the weight it carries. And if you have fought that fight yourself, I hope you share your story. No one should have to face it alone.